Welcome to the Romance Fiction Club, where different romance authors come together to share their romance works. If you think our library is missing a romance genre you love, please let us know in the comments. We will do our best to make that content available. Please subscribe to the channel so we can keep creating free audiobooks for you to enjoy. Thank you so much for being with us, and have a wonderful listening.
This content is adapted in order to comply with YouTube guidelines. If you wish to access hundreds of romance novels filled with steamy scenes, join the club through the link available in the description. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel, and thank you.
Alien Discovery. An alien sci-fi romance. Written by Ella Wayne, a USA Today Bestselling Author. Prologue. Zapra Stroganer stared into the sky for a long moment, reveling in the golden light. She studied the two moons she could see. The third was just below the horizon. This would be one of the last times she saw this sky. Her world, Yaris, was dying, drawing too close to the sun. She and the council had devised a plan that had spanned 3 generations to initiate, and they were finally evacuating the planet. It hadn't happened without a few casualties, and not everyone was going to make it. Several thousand had opted to remain on their planet, choosing to die with it. Which had been good. They had discovered several other worlds in this galaxy to co-inhabit, but they weren't all good fits. There were 8 which would require many sacrifices and the ability to fit into the current societies in order to survive. But that would mean nothing if they couldn't figure out how to create new young. With their sun drawing ever closer, the radiation destroyed their ability to produce young naturally. Each world was set to discover their own solution. If they could not, their race would eventually die out. Zapra didn't have high hopes. But they had to find a way. The OM were tracking them, following them through the wormhole gates to each of the worlds they'd discovered. She didn't know why. She only knew that they'd once had 26 colonies. And now they had 18. The OM were incredible fighters and able to wipe them out with supreme ease. Zapra had been assigned to the farthest outpost, Earth. It wasn't her choice. But she would take her station and fulfill her duties the best she could. She would serve her people with the honor they deserved. But without hope. She would serve her people, but without the hope they would actually survive. Earth was hostile and one of the worst locations they had discovered. Which was why she'd been assigned to it. She was shrewd and would do what had to be done to continue their race. With one last look at the sun she'd been born under, she turned and stepped through the ring. Chapter 1. Charles stepped through the door into his new quarters. I better not be assigned to the breeder program. He realized that was a very real possibility, but with his mind and abilities, breeding was the worst thing he could do to help his people. It would be a waste of time. The human women they found whose DNA was compatible enough to begin the breeding process were delicate and required time to woo. About that time, one of the breeders was led through one of the hallways 2 stories below. He could see her through the glass. She was tall, her long, dark hair falling down her back in luscious waves. Her breasts were perky as she walked with dutiful purpose behind the scientist who led her. She wore the dress of his people, but in a pale shade of blue, a belt sinking it at the waist. She was perfection, even to the Grimm, his species. Even in her doll-like state, he could tell that she was a fighter. If only they could turn that inhibitor off and allow her personality to shine through, he wouldn't mind being a breeder, especially if he was assigned to her harem. But being in the breeding program would take time away from what he needed to focus on. Time they didn't have. Charles had been awakened by an alert, telling him that someone was dangerously close to Base 8. His team was in charge of maintaining the security of this pod, but ultimately, he answered to someone who was in charge of the security of the entire base. Could it be that the OM had already discovered them? That they knew where Base 8 was located? Charles doubted it. It was probably somebody lost or looking for aliens. Glancing at the monitors at Derrick's station, He saw a Volkswagen bus stop along the highway a couple of miles away and a man and a woman got out. Alien hunters. Great. He readied the disorienting field generator just in case they got too close, and then continued to ignore them. He stepped to the console that contained all of his notes on the shield and growled. Marcus was an absolute slob and had left a mess everywhere. He was brilliant as long as his hands were moving, but as soon as those things stopped, it took everything in Charles not to kill him. With his console cleared of the American junk food Marcus had taken to love lately, he was able to work. They had a lot of problems. The most glaring one was that they were an alien race to this planet and were stranded. The wormhole gates had to be closed down because the OM were threatening to close in on them. They'd figured out a way to track the worm technology. And this world wasn't open to taking in aliens. They struggled with the idea of taking people from other countries, much less from another world. This world, these people, were filled with such hate. To be discovered here would mean the destruction or the enslavement of their race on the Earth station. His job was to ensure that Base 8 was never discovered. Joey walked in, a large burrito in his hand. "You eat yet?" Charles glared at the burrito. "You went out again. To that burrito place. The food is amazing." Joey was tall, dark-skinned, and had long, black hair. "You also know better." As their assimilation expert, he should know that stealth and staying hidden meant keeping their people safe. Joey raised a dark eyebrow. "You and I have different definitions of know better. We're supposed to be blending in. Part of that is showing up to places and being seen." They'd had this discussion before, and Charles still didn't agree. Their race was being threatened. They had no idea if the other planets had been successful or not. He had no idea if his little sister was okay on her new home world, for instance. Communications were down until they knew that the OM were no longer tracking them. Here on Earth, it seemed pretty evident that the OM were on their trail. "I take it the threat isn't imminent," Joey said. "Just tell me you didn't lead them right to us." Joey gave Charles a look that said he didn't as he took another giant bite of his burrito, his cheeks bulging with food as he chewed. Why couldn't anyone on his team take this situation seriously? Joey didn't say another word as he took his seat at his station, looking at all the surveillance they had. Tourists. Obviously. Though, that wasn't obvious. They'd been tricked into believing that before. The government was getting trickier and more devious. And they were getting better at locating them, using any method the Grimm could think of to hide. Just keep your eyes on them. Charles had to figure out a new way to keep Base 8 safe. That was his job. The base had motors and a star drive, though the drive would never be used to travel in space. It was meant to allow them to build their city however big they needed to and move it if they were discovered. That would be helpful because the people of Earth were not a trusting bunch and it was hard to find places to hide, even in the desert of New Mexico. His current project was working on shields that would deflect the humans' newest radar they were developing. They had someone on the inside of some base, apparently. At least, Charles assumed that because the information seemed solid. They were developing a technology humans shouldn't even be able to understand yet, unless they had a genius who could see beyond their current physical limits, and a genius like that hadn't been seen in a very long time. And that was what led Charles to believe the OM were closer to them than they'd hoped. Derek came in a little later, not saying a single thing. He was tall, well-built, and had long, black hair as well, but his skin was pale. As head of security, he didn't have to say much. He just needed to speak when it was really necessary. Kirk burst into the room with a wild grin on his face, his curly brown hair looking like it hadn't been combed in a while, and his clothes rumpled. "I did it and I have news." Charles turned to him in irritation. Kirk invented stuff, most of which didn't work the way he'd designed it. "Did what?" "Got a message out and back." Kirk let out a whoop and then draped himself on Charles's large, flat console. As soon as his skin contacted the touch screens, those screens went dark. Charles wanted to wring the man's neck, but if what he said was true. To home. No, but close. Zunus. Excitement flared in Charles's chest. That was the planet his sister had been relocated to. What did you hear? Well, only that they received the message, but this is great. It really was. As much as Charles hoped he could have gleaned just a little more information out of the man, that was at least something. And the OM can't track it. Kirk's grin widened as he shook his head. I've sent the plans to them. They're going to send them on to the other worlds, and soon, our network should be up and operational. That was possibly some of the best news Charles had heard in weeks. Good. Now, go take a bath. You stink. Not quite so fast, Zapra Strognor said as she strode into their room. She was tall, trim, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight braid down her back. She was their base commander and lead scientist. You will be having dinner in my dining hall tonight. That meant they were about to find out what their assignment was finally, or they were about to be assigned a breeding partner. Charles really hoped it was an assignment. He didn't agree with their breeding program. We'll be there, Charles said for the group. Zapra nodded in acknowledgement and then turned on her heel and left. She is one chilly woman, Joey muttered. That she was. Kirk grinned, clapped Charles on the shoulder. I'll find Marcus and tell him the good news. Thanks. Honestly, Charles couldn't figure out a reason why Zapra had collected the 5 of them together. They barely got along, and their pooled strengths and specialties didn't make a special project team list. At least, not one that he could fathom. Unless they were supposed to follow Kirk's lead and create some kind of tech that could help them fly under the OM's cover. If that was the case, then, well, he was all for that. Charles was one of the brightest tacticians and leaders they had. Kirk was a brilliant inventor. Nothing ever got past Derek and his security. Marcus was amazing with his hands. He could build anything, no matter the state of the plans given to him. Joey, though. He was the oddball and the reason Charles worried that they weren't going to be assigned to a task that would help their race, but to a breeder. Charles put it out of his mind and continued to work, running through the calculations and simulations on the modifications to the shield technology they already had in place. If he didn't find a way to modify what they already had, he was going to have to dump the current tech and replace it. That presented entirely new issues, like the lapse in time it would take to swap the 2 systems out. An hour slipped past without Charles even realizing it until another proximity alarm went off. He went to Derek's consoles and looked at what the cameras were picking up. The couple from earlier was practically headed right toward them. The woman carried some sort of device in her hand, and they were both looking around as if expecting to see something pretty specific. Charles pushed the button on the disorienting field. It didn't faze the 2 travelers at all. Alarm shot through Charles. Raise the alarm. He wasn't a soldier. It wasn't his job to go and collect the 2 humans. His job was to ensure someone else could. Within moments, Grimm soldiers surrounded the 2 humans. The lead Grimm brought out the knockout knob, as they'd begun calling it, and both humans slumped to the desert floor. Come on, Charles told Derek, and they went down to holding. The man was in one holding cell and the woman was in the other, with the observation room in between. The observation room actually connected to 8 interrogation rooms, with large windows taking up all of the round wall space. Entry was gained through a lift in the floor. Charles studied them both. They seemed simple. But then again, most humans did. I'm going in. No one ever entered an interrogation room. They hologrammed themselves into place, but the technology was so advanced that the person being interrogated generally thought they had a real person in there with them. He looked down at the driver's license the guards had pulled off of him. Eric Snyder. Charles chose the man first. His hologram appeared behind the man and he walked around the table to the other side. What are you doing here? Eric looked up at Charles and a cold smile lanced his lips. So, it's true. He really hated it when people played coy. What's true? Eric gestured to Charles with a wave of his hand. All the fancy tech. You're not from this planet. What did Eric know? Who are you working with? Wouldn't you like to know? Eric sneered. He really would. The government? Eric rolled his eyes. Is that the only person you could think of? No. Then who? Charles hoped he didn't hear the word roll off the man's tongue. Eric seemed to think about what he was going to say and then stopped himself. I'm going to do you a favor. Excellent. I'm going to tell you the God's honest truth. Won't that be enlightening? Eric nodded, studying Charles. I'm here because my neighbor has gone missing. Again. And his missing neighbor brought Eric to base 8. How? And how had they messed up? She's been having this feeling like she's been kidnapped and she keeps going on about being pregnant when she isn't. A breeder. This could potentially be bad. I tracked you here, Eric said proudly. Well, I tracked her here. I put a tracking device on her and then used the app thing, whatever. It's on my phone. And that's how I know she's here. This could be disastrous and it was something they hadn't thought of. Charles, Derek said in Charles's earpiece. We have to go. They can sit and stew for a bit. This was something he needed to bring to Zapra's attention anyway. Without another word, Charles disconnected the hologram signal. This was a problem, but largely because it was something they hadn't counted on. Someone actually cared about one of their breeders enough to put a tracking device on her. Or, one of the OM had figured out what they were doing and tracked one of the breeders down to track. Either way, was a disaster. Chapter 2. Zapra greeted them at the door to her private dining area, a polite smile on her severe face. I'm glad you were able to make it. I heard we had a breach. Marcus didn't like the base commander. She just seemed so cold all the time, like she didn't even have emotions. How could a woman live like that? That's what he wanted to know. Charles could probably tell him how that worked. Marcus didn't like Charles either, and he didn't doubt the feeling was more than mutual. Especially with the way Charles would glare at him, as if wondering how in the hell he'd managed to make on Charles the almighty and glorious team. Yeah. Well, Marcus wondered that a little, too. Everybody else was, well, they were pretty amazing at what they did. Marcus? He just built stuff. That's all he did. What are we doing here? Charles asked. Having dinner. Zapra led the way to a large, black table laden with food. Her dining hall was pretty bare. She didn't believe in decoration. Or personality. Marcus followed the men to the table and took a seat. He didn't pretend he would have anything to offer to this conversation because he knew for certain that he wouldn't. However, the food at Zapra's was better than anything he'd get in the mess hall. One of the reasons he was glad to be out of basic quarters and had been thrust on this team was so that he'd have better food. The best food, of course, went to the breeders. Marcus could tell that Charles didn't want to be a part of the breeders' program. It was in the things he said when he didn't think anyone else was listening. But Marcus heard him. He thought the breeders' program was something that should be performed by the people who didn't have much to offer. Which was a dumb idea. Marcus wasn't a scientist or anything, but even he knew that in order for the race to continue and to prosper, they needed the genes of the best of the best. Which was how he knew they weren't there as breeders. He was on the team and he was far from the best. No one wanted him on their team. No one. He annoyed almost everyone. If it wasn't right away, it would happen slowly over a period of time, but his relationships always ended the same. The people he'd been thrust on would want him off the team. Zapra and the rest of the team exchanged pleasantries while Marcus ignored them and ate. He didn't really care about the people they just caught. He knew he should, but he didn't. There was nothing he could do. He fixed things and built things. People were things to be fixed. They were just people. He couldn't build their personalities or their minds. He couldn't break them either. He was concerned that they'd gotten so close so quickly. Base 8 hadn't even been in its new location for more than a few months. Base 6 had been in the area, finding suitable breeders, but they shouldn't have left that heavy a footprint on the surrounding society to make people actually care about locating them. This was bad. And he still didn't really care. The food was good. Zapra was really getting into the whole learning their ways thing. He longed for the food of his world, but knew he was unlikely to ever see it again. So, he did his part by immersing himself in the food of the region. None of it seemed to be good for the people who ate it, but it did taste amazing. "I wanted to discuss your new project," Zapra said, her voice ringing out like a bell. That got Marcus's attention. He wanted to know what they were doing. Zapra inhaled deeply and set her fork down on the table. "Charles has been working on a modification to the shields that will stop humans from finding us using the new technology they're developing." Now, that was news. Marcus hadn't heard about this new tech or that Charles had been working on anything. "What's the tech?" Zapra's eyes settled on him with cold resignation. "They're using OM technology." That gave Marcus pause. That meant the OM were close. The rest of the team reacted in their own way, but Marcus wasn't paying attention to them. He focused on his plate, not really seeing it. Instead, he was looking at the designs in OM technology he did know and how they could modify what they had. If they'd been able to bring more from their world, they might have a chance, but with the technology that the humans possessed? The good news was that it would take humans a while to figure it out. "So, we have full approval to work on it," Charles said. "You do?" Charles met the eyes of everyone on the team except Marcus and nodded. "We'll get started on that right away. I'm more concerned with the fact that someone tracked one of your breeders to our location. How are we going to prevent that from happening in the future?" Leave it to Charles to want to mess with things they had no business in dealing with. Something flashed over Zapra's expression and then she gestured to the guards at the door. They opened the door. A beautiful human woman walked through the door, her hands folded in front of her. She wore the robes of the Grimm women, teal and blue with elaborate gold embroidery along the edges. She bowed her head and kept her gaze on the floor. Something flashed over Charles's face like he recognized her or something. Marcus turned in his chair. "Is this the woman they tracked?" Zapra nodded. "What's special about her?" Charles asked, but there was something wrong with his voice, like it was strained or something. "We don't know yet," Zapra said carefully, gauging him. "She's the only human female we've found who has had successful pregnancies every single time." That was unheard of. Not all pregnancies went to full term, and even if they did, many had birth defects, which they were fairly certain were partly due to the environmental contamination the human females were subjected to. "That's amazing," Derek said, pressing a finger to his temple. Did he know something Marcus didn't? "Like. And she's being assigned to you." Silence slammed into place around the table. "That?" Marcus hadn't seen that coming. "To see why?" Charles asked carefully. "Or to breed with her?" "Both." Zapra rose. "No one is above their duty, Charles. Not even someone as brilliant as you. You and your team will mate with her and you will produce young." "No." She smiled coldly at him. "If you do not, you will be taken off your project, and your entire team will be sent back through the gates to our home world. Do I make myself perfectly clear? No one said anything. Marcus didn't because there was no sense for him to say a thing. He wasn't really a part of the team and he was certain it had never been intended for him to mate with the woman. He was there by some fluke or accident and nothing more. No matter how beautiful she wasn't his. Zapra left without saying anything further, leaving them all there to stare at the woman. Charles stood up and walked to her carefully, his hand clasped behind his back. He walked in a slow circle around her and then stopped in front. "What is your name?" "Gail," she said pleasantly, almost rehearsed. She was lovely. Marcus would give her that. "What do you think about this situation you're in?" "I will comply as instructed." Charles spun on his heel and walked purposefully to the table, slamming his fists on it. The dinnerware jumped. "She is inhibited," he roared. "I won't touch her." He disappeared from the room, returning to their quarters. Derek sighed and stood. "I'll go talk to him." "I'm not going back home." "I'm going with you," Kirk said. Joey just looked at Marcus. "Well, we have to follow the rules and," he gestured to the woman with a shrug, then shook his head. "But if her will is stripped away and she's forced to comply, that isn't going to make it easy. It's like taking her against her will, and I'm not into that." Marcus had an idea. "What if we overrode the inhibitor?" Joey sat up straight, intrigue written on his face. Marcus knew how to build things and to fix them, but Joey understood programming. The two of them could possibly figure out how to make this happen if they worked together. If we disabled it, then she'd be allowed to think for herself and to give her permission. And then Charles wouldn't have anything to worry about and we could stay on a planet that isn't about to die. Exactly. Joey grinned. "That's perfect." Marcus got up and went to Gail. "Not here, though. We need to take her to our quarters." "That's a great idea. All my tools are there anyway." So were Marcus's. They reached out for Gail, beckoning her to come with them. She came to them easily, taking their arms as they walked her out of the dining hall. This was too easy. It didn't take long to get to their quarters. As soon as they stepped into their ring of rooms, a cold buzz rolled over him. Joey's dark eyes widened. The time displacement field. I'd heard about this. So had Marcus. In order to take the breeders from their lives and have enough time to mate, the Grimm put up a time displacement field. Several days would go by inside the rooms while 1 hour would occur outside of them. They also used the time displacement fields to work on large projects that required a tighter timeline, supposedly. This was going to be perfect. Whoever had tracked her there would be stalled and they'd have time to take out her inhibitor and figure out how she was tracked. And figure out how to get Charles and the rest of the team to mate with her because there was no way she was mating with him. Marcus and Joey got to work. Gail was perfectly compliant and didn't even do much more than flinch when they accidentally pinched her. The inhibitor was located in the back of her neck. It was something that the biolabs of Base 6 had installed on her years ago. The melding with her spine was a work of pure genius, which made it harder for them to override it. After what felt like hours, though, they found what they needed almost at the same time. Joey grinned at him. "We got it." Marcus liked Joey. He was the first person to see Marcus for a person instead of trouble that had to be dealt with. He actually felt himself relaxing around the other man, and that was an odd thing for him. They worked on the device using the tablet they had connected to her. Gail was bent forward, her dark hair falling over her face. Joey said, a frown marring the dark features. "If we do this, we might disable the device permanently." "That's good, right? Then she'd never have her will taken from her." "True, but then she might become a security risk." That was something Marcus hadn't thought of. Security risks is something we deal with all the time. True. Joey punched a few more things on the screen. It looks like the memory inhibitors will most likely still be in place. Marcus didn't like that idea. But we can install. Joey's face lit up again as he scrambled to his side of the common room to grab something and then came back. A back door so that we can remind her again when she comes back. That sounds perfect. Or, at least, Marcus hoped it was perfect. He was starting to get a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach that this was a very bad idea. With a few more stabs at the touch screen and one adjustment from Marcus's tool, they were done. They took a step back and waited for Gail to react. She didn't for a really long time. Maybe we did something wrong? Joey asked. Marcus just shrugged. He had no idea what he was doing. He worked on tech. This was really too close to working on people and he couldn't fix. Gail whipped her head up, her bright blue eyes wide. She saw them and then let out a blood-curdling scream. Maybe this hadn't been a great idea after all. Chapter 3. Gail had no idea what was going on. The last thing she remembered was going to bed. She'd had a hard time getting to sleep because she had a song that was just on the annoying side of bursting out of her. The music was there. The words were more emotions than lyrics. It was so close to being ready to write. Which kept her from being able to sleep. She didn't even remember going to sleep. And then she woke up and found herself in what looked like a spaceship or a really good sci-fi movie set with two incredibly hot men looking up at her. One of them had a screwdriver in his hand. In his hand. What the heck was he planning on doing with that thing? But his big, light brown eyes were filled with worry. She hadn't even realized she'd been screaming until silence suddenly filled the room. The man with the curly brown hair and the amazing light brown eyes raised one dark brow. "Are you okay?" he asked slowly. Like she was deaf or dumb or mute or something. "I don't know. Where are we?" She had a bazillion questions and had no idea where to even start. "You're on," well, he turned and looked at the other man. He might as well have been a Native American model. He was so incredibly hot and lickably delicious. His long, black hair cascaded down his back and his dark eyes stared at her with worry and something else. Irritation. "We're still going to be able to block her memories afterward," Curlyhead said. "So, we should be able to tell her." Eagle Boy narrowed his eyes at her for a long moment, and then nodded once. Curlyhead turned back to her with a grin. "I'm Marcus." "That's Joey." "Great." They had names. Though, the name Joey just didn't seem to fit Eagle Boy. She might start calling him that just for fun anyway. "Where are we?" "Base 8. Marcus gave her an almost comical grin and held out his hands as if offering a surprise. What the hell did that even mean? "I don't know of any Base 8. Like, what is this?" Marcus stammered and turned to Joey again. "It's a refuge," Joey said, turning away. He came back with what looked like an iPad. Well, except that it was all glass. Who even had tech like that? It wasn't humans. That was for sure. Or it wasn't humans from this time. They were from the future. That had to be it. "What year are you from?" Or in? Should she be asking what year she was in? Maybe she'd been the one to time travel. Joey shook his head to tell her that was a silly question. "It's the same year. We didn't time travel." "But did I?" Because she was certain she was on to something here. "No. We're just outside Albuquerque, so we're not in outer space either." "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked. "Are you feeling yourself?" "I'm upset." What was he even asking her? "Right, but how are you feeling?" Are you having any issues with memories? I remember everything just fine. Was this man insane? Marcus winced and turned to Joey. He rolled his eyes and knelt in front of her, his iPad, tablet, whatever it was called in his hands. You have a device installed that interacts with your nervous system and we need to check to see if you're doing okay. Connected to my, what? Oh hell no. Who the hell are you people? Joey blinked rapidly and stood. She seems fine. We should present her to Charles. Who the hell is Charles? Joey didn't answer her, but he did exit the room through a door. Marcus offered his hand and helped her stand. You'll let us know if you get dizzy or sick or start feeling back, won't you? Right after she smacked him one. Though, she wasn't really a fighter. She was much better at fighting with the power of her mind and wit. Sure. She followed him out. There was really something installed in my spine. He nodded. It still is. We just turned it off. And, he winced again. There's a good chance we won't be able to turn it back on again. Oh, that was just, too much. It was all too much. They walked through a short hallway and into another circular room. What was it with this place and circular rooms? 3 other men were in the other room. One looked like he was Asian and incredibly hot. Another also had curly hair, but lighter, almost blonde with a ready smile and super dark, puppy dog eyes, but supermodel hot. And the fourth? He was obviously their leader. He was bigger than the rest, with blonde-tipped hair and dark facial hair. He turned to them and shook his head, waving them off. I already said I wouldn't touch her. Wouldn't touch her. What the? Because of the inhibitor, Marcus said. Exactly. Surferman turned back to the glass tablet he was reading from, his lips moving as he read. And that's not likely to change. But we need. To what? Surferman set the tablet down hard enough that it should have cracked. Sleep with her. Make babies with her when she has no abilities to say no. What? She was there to breed. With them. Sure. They were hot. Like, stupid hot. Seriously, they were. And she wasn't morally compromised by the thought of having them all as lovers. But, she'd been brought there, to breed. Before she had a chance to be too upset, a few pieces started clicking into place. She'd felt pregnant several times over the past few years, but each time, she'd wake up the next day with a scar that disappeared within an hour or two, and the feeling of being pregnant was gone. She also remembered vague things, like seeing doctors above her and talking to strange men. It was like abduction stories. Kind of. But she'd always ignored those, knowing there was no way they could possibly be real. I'm not mating a doll, Surferman shouted, gesturing to her. Good, she shouted back. Because I'm not mating you either. Surferman stopped dead in his tracks and stared at her like she'd grown a third boob. Well, at least it got him to shut up. She took in a deep breath, trying hard to steady her nerves, but she was nervous. She had no idea where she was or what was going on or how to get back home. Maybe someone would like to tell me what the hell is going on here. What? Surferman didn't even finish his question. He pointed at Gail and advanced on Marcus, who held up his hands in surrender and took a step back. You said you wouldn't touch her while the inhibitor was on. And you were so horny you had to have her. Surferman demanded. No. The insult was visible all over Marcus's face. I already know I'm not part of the harem. You are. You have the genes our race needs. I'm just a, he didn't finish. She wanted to know what he was going to say next. You're just a what? He raised his shoulders in a deep shrug. Nothing special. They are. They're, he sighed and gestured to them. They're all very talented and very smart. And you're the only one who thought to turn the inhibitor off, Gail said softly. You're the only one who cared enough to let me decide. Surferman stopped in his tracks and turned to her, assessing her. Who are you? Who the hell are you? Time to get pissed and lay into them a little. You abducted me, near as I can tell. You took me away from my home and now I'm expected to sleep with you and have little, I don't even know what. Babies with you. Are you aliens? Yes, Surferman said without hesitation. Charles, Asian Awesome said in warning. So, Surferman was Charles. How did they have? Why are your names so common? That can't be your real names. Oh, God. She was really going to say it. Your world. Holy crap. That sounded insane when said aloud. They're not. Charles glanced around the room, and then walked to her, grabbing her elbow and escorting her out through another door that led to a long corridor with curved windows on the left side. It looked like a sci-fi city in the New Mexico desert. There were tall towers or spires that reached high into the sky and several smaller buildings that connected them all. And each one was either circular or octagonal in shape. There wasn't a single square to be seen in this city. So, she said, coming to a stop and trying hard to gain her bearings and not freak out. This is Base 8 and you're really aliens. He stood beside her silently. Yes, was all he said finally. That didn't sound crazy at all. And I'm here to make babies. Partially true. Yes. She bit her bottom lip as she watched a hawk high in the sky, but as it got too close, something glimmered up there and he flew away. Why me? Because you have a gene that gives you the ability to mate with us. A gene. That was very science fiction. Had she fallen into the TV or something? Yes. He wasn't going to give her any more than that. Obviously. I haven't actually given birth to a child before, but I'm pretty sure I've been pregnant before. He nodded curtly. Base 6 was here first, scouting for women like you, capable of accepting our seed. And why don't you just, oh, God. She couldn't believe she was actually going to say this. Use in vitro insemination. It doesn't work. He closed his eyes, his lips tight. Finally, he turned toward her. We're the last of our species. Our world died. Our women are barren. Human women can't carry our young to full term, and we don't know why. When you are impregnated, your fetus is transferred to one of our women, and the pregnancy is completed. Though, not each birth produces a full-term child. That sounded horrible. For everyone involved. And the inhibitor. Why use it? Because, he said, looking back out over the city, when the program first started, too many of the human women remembered and sent the government after us. We're trying to survive, Gail. It's not like we can go back to our own planet. There isn't a planet left for us to go to. Something in his tone, or maybe it was his face, let her know that wasn't a complete truth, but it was close. I'm not going to just sleep with you all. I would not ask you to. But you were instructed to. She appreciated the fact that he seemed morally conflicted about forcing her into this situation, but she didn't feel great about him not wanting her. How silly was that? He was just so lovely and delicious to look at, though. I was. What would it be like to be one of the last surviving members of her species? What happens if you don't? He was quiet for a long while. Charles was just a quiet man. The obvious leader, for sure, but a quiet one. She felt comforted just being with him. And turned on. There was just something about him that made her lust after him, wanting to run her hand on his body, to feel his rippling muscles twitching under her touch. Would he feel different? Would being with him be any different than being with a human man? And would being with him change her? Would she be able to sleep with another man afterward? She probably shouldn't be thinking these things. She should be trying to figure out a way out of there. But instead, there she was, sizing him up like he was a tasty morsel for her to consume. Just, give me a little time to figure out how to clean up this mess, Charles said. I will make this right. She believed he would. Am I in any danger? He shook his head. Not even a little. Well then, in that case, it was time to get to know these aliens from another planet. Chapter 4. Charles led her back into the common room where all of the boys were still waiting as if with bated breath. Even if he was still very annoyed with Joey and Marcus. Let me introduce to everyone, Charles said with a hint of a smile, trying at the very least to be cordial. This is Kirk. Puppy dog eyes. It was going to take her more than a minute to remember everyone's names. Kirk got to his feet, a ready smile on his face, and offered his hand. I like building models. She gave him a hesitant smile. Models are cool. And geeky. Was he a really hot geek? If so, that just doubled his hotness. He also studies the stars, Charles said. That was a real job. Well, they were aliens, so maybe. Okay. She didn't know what else to say. She really liked Kirk. And she'd remember that name. Captain Kirk, like the one from the new Star Trek movies. Super hot and with all that charm. Yeah. This is Derek. Asian Awesome was named Derek. There was no way she was remembering that. He might have to get his own nickname. Derek nodded, closing his eyes in respect momentarily. He's our lead security officer for our team, Charles said. Great. With security and everything. Awesome. You've met Joey. Charles gestured to Eagle Eyes. And Marcus. She was going to name him Mr. Curious. Maybe. She didn't know yet. And what do you do? She asked, though she was already fairly certain. I'm a mathematician and the leader of this pod. Oh. She had all their names and title, well, occupations, rather, and now she had no idea what to do. Marcus, Charles said, looking at the man. Why don't you take her around our pod and tell her a little bit about our situation? And how much exactly should we tell? Marcus asked. Charles thought about that for a moment. Everything. If she's going to join us, or if we are to join her harem, rather, then I want her to know everything. Marcus licked his lips in surprise. Okay. Well, we're going to, Joey, we'll need to, he frowned and stopped himself. Yes, Marcus, Charles said, the name coming out like a threat. We are going to have to figure out how to keep a lid on this. Gail didn't miss what he was implying. He thought Marcus had screwed up in releasing her from the bonds of the inhibitor. That made her dislike him just a little. She smiled at Marcus. Show me around. And she was going to see what she could learn about this place that might help her. Escape. What? Run away. If they were able to find her and abduct her from her bed, they could find her anywhere she went. They were aliens. There was no running away from them and hoping that they'd never find her. That was never going to happen. Ever. So she just needed to see what she could learn about them, period. Were they evil aliens? Were they the good guys like Superman or Supergirl? Would her babies have superhuman powers? Did they? Were they going to bring a whole mess of other aliens to come and destroy their world like Thor did in the Marvel movies? And did she even want this? If she didn't, was there some way out for her? And if she did want out, was that somehow selfish of her? She was talking to a species that had no way to procreate, for crying out loud. Weren't they being selfish by just taking her against her will? How desperate were they? Very. Marcus got up and led her out into the corridor. I won't be able to take you into too much of the base, he said, because the time field is around our corridors. But we can look out and you can ask questions if you like. Time field. And he just threw it out there like it was nothing. Oh, yeah. He ran his hand through his curly hair, incredibly cute in his uncertainty. Because of the breeding program, and we don't want to pull you out of your life for too long. Because you're being considerate, or because you don't want to raise flags. Honestly. His expression was open as he shoved his hands in pockets and shrugged, leaning against the window. Probably both. There are people who care about the women we find and others who see them as nothing more than a means to an end. So, yeah. You sound like humans. And she meant that. I think we're a lot closer than many would think. Which led her mind down side trips that were disturbing. How were they so close? So, you want to know about us and how we got here? Obviously. Okay. His smile was embarrassed, like she'd just insulted him. I'm sorry, she said, touching his arm. Electricity radiated between them, not the actual physical kind, but the attraction kind. He was strong. And very good looking. She could get used to these guys. Except maybe Charles, if he kept being so rude. But, even he was sweet. And she appreciated the way Marcus talked to her, like she was a real person and not an agenda. He shook his head and smiled her concern away like it was a well-practiced response. Well, we come from a planet far from here. It's really close to the center of the galaxy. What happened? Nothing much. Just the sun dying. It's getting bigger, getting ready to supernova. We've been evacuating the planet for a few generations. So you're not the very last of your species. He chuckled. Not quite. There are a few other worlds we discovered and we're trying to cohabitate on, but the OM are after us. She immediately got flashbacks of city-destroying battles with aliens in the various movies she'd seen. How bad are they? Well, they're trying to end us, so I'd say pretty bad. Why? Well, he said with a sigh. We didn't do everything amazingly the first time. The very first world we found, we got a little too overzealous and overpopulated their world. We were trying to evacuate as many of our women as we could before the sun destroyed all of their reproduction abilities. Oh. That makes a lot of sense. And it did. That much radiation would destroy a lot more than just eggs. What happened? The OM killed all the Grimm and saved their planet. We lost most of our women from that world. We tried to evacuate as many as we could, but we didn't succeed. He twisted around to look out over the city. We made a mistake. A big one, and cost us a lot. So, time for some silly questions. Do you have superpowers? He snorted. No. No laser eyes? That's not even a thing. She could talk with Marcus all day. He was just easy to banter with. You can't blow over a building with your breath. Derek could first thing in morning. He pulled a yuck face. She laughed. You guys seem close. Not really. He got that expression that felt well-practiced and overused again. They are, sure. They work together really well. What do you do? I just build things. That's pretty impressive. Not like them. Besides, I just annoy people. Why? He gave her a tight-lipped smile. I believe you call it ADHD. Oh. She understood that only too well, and she knew how to handle it. She'd been in a foster home with a kid with ADHD. The parents had actually been really super and had helped him manage it while teaching the other kids how to help him. That had been her favorite home growing up. What do you enjoy making the most? He thought about that, his pale brown eyes going distant, and then a smile lit up his face. Robotics. I know it's silly. We're far beyond that now, but I love making a stick move on its own. Or turning a piece of metal into something practical. That sounds amazing. It keeps me busy. And your hands focused. His gaze met hers. Exactly. When his eyes met hers, it was like a collision. It felt like he was reaching for a lifeboat and she was it. No one had ever looked at her like that before. He ducked his head and scuffed his toe. Anyway, we're just trying to keep from being discovered here. Humans here are pretty hateful. Not everyone. No, but, he turned to actually face the scene beyond the window. They hate easily. And we saw what happened with the OM. They were similar. I mean, they looked different, but they had societies very similar to yours. Looked different? Like, little gray men. Because if that was the case, then the OM had already visited. No. They're more lizard-like. But they walk on 2 feet. Oh. It'd be hard to hide that. They have technology that helps them blend in better. So, you wouldn't know you were talking to one unless you knew what to look for. Or had sex with them. Oh, that. He laughed. So, are you like this? She gestured to him. Under your clothes? He looked surprised. Yeah. I mean, yeah. We had to undergo a few operations to be able to live here. Like, humans have a couple different organs that we needed to build because we just didn't need it. She opened her mouth to say something, but was hit with a barrage of memories and emotions. She recalled all the times she'd been abducted and the experiments and tests they'd run on her. She remembered feeling trapped, afraid, and alone. She remembered having to dance with people, and remembered telling them about her culture while she screamed inside her mind to make it stop. Suddenly, there were multiple sets of hands on her. She heard one voice clearly over the noise inside her head. It was Charles. Fix this. And then the world went blank. Chapter 5. Marcus and Joey took her back to their lab. It wasn't really anything special, but it was where they put their extra toys and stuff. The circular room was divided in half. Joey's half was extremely neat and Marcus's was extremely not. They pushed some of the things on Marcus's side of the table located in the middle of the room aside, several things clanking to the metal floor, and laid Gail on the table. She looked so innocent and vulnerable. She was. She really was, so it didn't matter what she looked like. She was vulnerable. But was it because of what they'd done? Joey hooked up his tablet and Marcus rolled Gail onto her side to study her neck some more. Everything they'd done shouldn't have had this effect. Well, probably not. He'd never really tampered with the biomods they installed in humans and he didn't know human anatomy very well. Maybe there was something more going on here than they realized. When Marcus hooked up his own pad to the device in her neck, he noticed a yellow light beeping in the lower corner. He touched it and it brought up a display of other devices that had been installed all along her spine. This was the kind of tech he'd worked on with his last team, a team he'd been kicked off of and was rather glad when it happened. That team had been ruthless, and didn't care what they did or how it affected other people. He hadn't dreamed for one moment that the tech they'd been working on would ever be used on breeders. He'd always thought it had been designed to be installed on the OM. After all, that's what he'd built it for. But maybe that's the reason he'd been kicked off the team. Maybe it was because they'd wanted to modify it to fit humans and they knew he wouldn't go along with it. He wouldn't have either. Joey, he said quietly. We have a problem. What? Joey glanced over at Marcus's tablet, looked away, and then returned his gaze to it in alarm. What is that? Marcus didn't know what to do. This tech was specifically designed so it could never be removed. It would integrate itself into the host completely. To remove the tech would mean killing the host, Gail. And she was the only person on this planet who actually looked at him like he wasn't crazy or a strain on them. "I don't recognize this tech," Joey said. "I do," Marcus said. "I helped build it." "No," Joey's dark eyes widened and he set down his tablet. "Oh." He opened the door into the other room. "Guys. Get in here. We've got a problem." Marcus didn't know what to do, but he knew one thing: he shouldn't be making any decisions about this that day. Charles and the other three filtered in. "What's going on?" Charles demanded. "Did you fix this?" Marcus wasn't great with conflict. He either popped his top and exploded, making an ass out of himself, or he made himself as small as he possibly could and stayed out of the way of others. Joey gestured for him to speak. He needed to because he was the only one who knew what was going on, but he really hoped that Charles wouldn't lose it on him. He was feeling protective of Gail and didn't know if he'd be able to keep himself from exploding, though he was fairly confident that Charles could handle whatever Marcus had for him. "I recognize the tech in her." Charles frowned and folded his arms over his chest. "That was a good sign, right? The last team I was on was charged with coming up with a biotech to install in the OM. It would keep them contained, controlled, and safe." Charles nodded. "I'd heard rumors about something like that. Before we finished it, I was kicked off the team." "Why?" Marcus shrugged. "I figured it was just because they were done with me. Like everyone else always was." Charles narrowed his eyes, but turned his attention to Gail. "And the woman?" "Gail?" "Because the woman had a name. She wasn't a sex slave or a robot. She was a person who looked at Marcus and saw him as a person, not an irritation. She has the same tech installed." Charles thought about that. "You overrode her inhibitor." "The normal inhibitor." "Yes." But, Charles shook his head, confused. Marcus ran through what he remembered, which was practically everything. He couldn't design a system on his own, but he understood everything in the systems that had been built and handed to him. It's designed to suppress OM tendencies of aggression. It targets the gene in their DNA that makes them OM. So, Charles turned to him. "Are you saying that Gail is OM?" Joey took a step between Charles and Gail, shielding her. "The OM gene might just be junk DNA in her system, the same that allows her to conceive grim children. Humans have a lot of junk DNA." He shrugged. "It might not have anything to do with her being OM." Another thought slammed into Charles so hard it was visible. Marcus thought he knew what it was. What if the OM are doing the same thing to her that we are? It would make sense. If that they were, that would be the reason the biotechs decided they had to install his device in her. It was their way of keeping her away from the OM and all to themselves. "That might be the reason she was tracked," Charles said and immediately spun on his heel and left. Marcus was going with him this time. Charles didn't even give him a second glance as if to tell him to stay behind. "What else can you tell me about this tech you designed?" "I didn't design it. But you did make it work. It's what you do. You take what others design and make it functional." He'd never looked at it that way. When Charles said it, it almost sounded like he wasn't a complete waste of space. Charles led them into a lift, the curved door sliding closed behind them. The lift went up and spilled them into a room with 8 windows, 6 of them dark. The other 2 revealed a single person. One a man and the other a woman. "These are the people who tracked Gail here." Charles went to the console in the middle of the observation room and tapped on the screen. Marcus had never been in an interrogation center before. He'd never needed to. That was security and he didn't work in that department. He built things that were never needed for this line of work. Something moved in the room with the woman. She didn't seem to notice. Another screen flashed green. Marcus stepped up to it to read. If Charles had let him in there, it must mean that he wouldn't mind if Marcus looked. Charles had initiated a DNA sampling. When the same movement occurred in the room holding the man, he reacted. He rose to his feet and swatted the air, trying to get away from the movement as if he couldn't see what it was. Which, he probably couldn't. The DNA extractor was a small device that could be used in the field of battle or an informal gathering. It was designed to have very little impact on the people they were getting samples from. Marcus frowned as another screen blipped green. "Let me out of here," the man shouted and beat against the wall that connected to the cell the woman was in. She didn't even flinch. That didn't surprise Marcus. He knew that the rooms were soundproof. He'd just never seen it before. Charles stared at the two screens, waiting. And then the first one lit up, the text read as an alert went out. The woman was OM. Every muscle in Marcus's body went rigid as he went into high alert. "Are we in trouble?" Charles remained calm as he watched the other screen. It hiccuped as the results were being processed, and then it went into warning mode as well. They were under attack. The OM knew where they were. Charles pressed a button on the console. A female voice came through the speaker, giving greeting. "Tell Zapra that we've been breached. The intruders are OM." "Of course." The speaker went silent. Charles turned the alert off and the lights went back to normal. Marcus hadn't even realized they'd been spinning, giving the alarm. "What do we do?" Marcus whispered. "You see why your tech was installed in Gail," Charles said calmly. "It's not my tech." Charles ignored him. "And I'm going to see what these two know." Marcus blinked rapidly, then left the same way they'd come. When he stepped back into the room with Gail and the rest of the team, he stopped as the full force of what he'd just learned hit him. "The OM found us. The two people who tracked her are OM." Derek said nothing. He simply disappeared through the door Marcus had just stepped through. Kirk took in a long, deep breath. "Okay. What do we do?" Together, the three of them went through each piece of tech that had been installed in Gail's nervous system. They mapped her DNA and did a complete sweep of her system. When they were done, they sat around stunned. That how Charles and Derek found them when they walked back in. "What's wrong?" Charles asked. Marcus gestured to the still comatose Gail. "She's an OM breeder. And she'd carried at least one OM fetus that they could gather. And that's the reason," Joey said, his voice filled with awe and horror at the same time, "that she makes such a perfect grim breeder. The fact that she has the junk DNA for both our races makes her children better suited to survival." "Are you?" Charles stopped himself. "Are the grim children she creates OM or grim?" "Grim," Kirk said definitively. "But if Base 6 is able to find more of the OM breeders, and if they take those breeders, they will bring the OM right down on us. That is a problem." And it was. The OM would destroy the Grim and the Earth if that's what it took. They'd proven that on Ilion, another world the Grim had attempted to relocate to. The OM had destroyed the planet itself in order to rid it of the Grim. Charles stared at Gail, his dark eyes filled with remorse. "See if you can wake her and find some way to fix this. If you can." "She's awake now." He shook his head and something else slipped into his dark gaze. "Respect. We can't put her to sleep again." He turned and left again. Marcus released a long breath. He knew how to do it, but it also meant that the human inhibitor would never work the same again. Joey looked over at him and raised two eyebrows. Kirk pursed his lips and just stared at Gail with unfocused eyes. This was the kind of problem that Marcus really didn't know how to fix. Chapter 6. Gail woke to 3 sets of worried eyes staring down at her. Marcus, Eagle Eyes, and Mr. Smiles surrounded her with concerned looks on their handsome faces. Marcus was the first to recover. He gave her a hesitant smile and offered his hand, pulling her to her feet. Gail sat on the edge of their work table and she had a headache. "What's going on?" she asked, rubbing her head. "Do you feel all right?" "Mr. Smiles," Kirk asked. "Just a headache." Eagle eyes, Joey, twisted around to retrieve something. He pressed it against her temple. "Better?" The headache disappeared as though it had never been there. She couldn't believe how these men treated her. She'd never been treated so well by men who actually said they liked her, much less men who felt she'd been thrust upon them. "What's going on?" Marcus shook his head and stepped back. "It's nothing." "It's something," Joey said, crossing his arms over his chest. "We're being invaded because the OM want you." "What?" About that time, Charles stepped into the room. "You're awake." She was. "What's going on? What is this about the OM wanting me?" The look on Charles's face showed he really didn't want to have that conversation. But she didn't care. She was pressing the issue. If he wouldn't tell her. He seemed to read that on her face. "Follow me." She scrambled to her feet and followed, wishing she was wearing real shoes and not this flimsy, thin slippers they'd given her. She was a hard stepper, not some graceful gazelle. She could use the extra support. "Where are we going?" "It's time you learned the truth," was all Charles said. She followed him down a corridor that was all windows and led to another, larger room. A slight buzz skittered over her skin as they exited that room into another corridor. "What was that?" He glanced at her and continued. "That was the time displacement field. So, we're in real time now." He nodded. There was something about his calm demeanor that made her feel better, safer, like whatever was going on, he'd be able to handle it. This place, this situation, terrified her. She couldn't believe she'd landed herself in this kind of thing. She had no idea how she'd escape even if she wanted to. She wanted to be a country music singer and songwriter. There were no heroics involved with that. She followed him into a lift that took them into another room with windows for interrogation rooms, only two of which were lit up. A man sat in one white room and a woman the other. "What is this?" "These are the people who tracked you here." The woman lifted her head. Gail sucked in her breath in surprise. "That's Bess, my neighbor." "And that's," she waited until the man looked at her. "That's her husband, Eric." "What's going on?" "They tracked you here." "What?" He was dead serious, but things just went to a whole new level of crazy for her. These were her neighbors, and they were just trying to help. And if they wound up dead because they'd tried to help her, she wouldn't be able to contain herself. She'd feel horrible. "They're OM," Charles said quietly. That shut up all the inside voices in her head. "The alien race that's trying to destroy yours." He nodded. Why?" She didn't even know how to form her question in all the words she needed. Her nice neighbors were aliens and she hadn't known. "Because you're a breeder for them." No. She sank into a chair. "This can't be happening. It's rare." "It's very rare," Charles said, touching her hand and kneeling beside her. "We didn't even know they were looking into this, trying to breed with humans." "Do you think they're trying to take over? Plan an invasion? With babies they pulled from her womb?" "It's possible they were looking for someone like you so they could track you to our base." "So, you don't think," she couldn't even finish the thought. But then images filled her mind of dark people, their faces filled with shadows thanks the lights behind them, looking down at her as they performed experiments. "We know you conceived at least one OM child." She felt like there were more memories like that one of the shadowed men inside her head. She just couldn't access them and she didn't know if she wanted to. "I don't understand." I thought they were more reptile-like. They are, but their genetic makeup is very similar to humans. I don't understand a lot about genetics. That's not my field, but it would seem that you're close enough. Like with you. He nodded. She rose to her feet and went to Bessa's window. Then why don't I see the alien face? Why do I see a human one? Because of their tech. He walked to the window and tapped several things. Suddenly, Bessa's human face disappeared and the face of a reptile-like human appeared. She blinked and turned her face to the window, her lizard tongue sneaking out. She said something, but Gail couldn't hear it. I don't understand, Gail whispered, completely overwhelmed. Charles touched her shoulder, offering her support. She leaned into him, needing the warmth of his hand and so much more. She didn't understand why she was so drawn to him. Maybe it was the fact that he looked so perfectly human. And maybe it was the fact that he didn't appreciate the situation they were in any more than she did. That seemed genuine, and in this world of aliens and science fiction, that was something she needed. Honest truth. It seems, he said quietly in her ear, that you contain 2 DNA chromosomes that are similar to both of our species. Then, I'm an alien. He sighed and turned her around to face him, peering deep into her eyes. What are the chances of there being 3 species of humans living on different planets that all share similar DNA? She shook her head. I don't know. That's all the kind of science I don't enjoy. It makes me feel stupid. He gave her a chiding look. The chances are slim, which means we probably all originated from another event similar to my planet's. Our original species probably had to send out lifeboats and populate other worlds in order to survive. That made sense. So, you're saying we're all aliens? He smiled at her and nodded. Yes. But, he shifted to look more closely at Bess, they evolved differently. Their world needed them to become something a little different than either of our worlds. And the other worlds we've discovered. They have similar human-like species, too, which are all mildly different. Due to evolution. Yes. I read an article that said we'd eventually evolve to having no toes. Where the heck did that even come from? She was freaking out, and this was just her way of dealing. He raised his eyebrows and said nothing. The OM consider us their enemy. Because you went to live on their world. We did worse. His voice was barely above a whisper. We were desperate, and it was the first world we'd come across. We weren't sure there would be another. She took a step away from him to look in his face. What did you do? We waged war on them. The commander at the time decided he would take over their world in order to provide a worldwide rescue mission for ours. Gail tried to imagine what that would be like. She tried replaying some of the science fiction alien invasion films she'd seen, and slept through, in her head. We intended to give them good lives. It was only supposed to be a temporary measure, or at least that's what we'd been told. But to them, she asked. How were you treating them? Apparently, not well. They launched a counterattack and took out most of our women, who we sent through first. She knew that part of the story. That was the reason why they needed to use humans to reproduce. We responded in kind. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the OM woman. Gail stared at the lizard face and tried to see Bess. She could almost through the cheekbones and the eyes. And there was still a person who had been a friend. I can see why they want to destroy you. So can I. And now I'm stuck in between the two of you. He gripped her arms and closed his eyes, breathing in calm. I will keep you safe. When he said that, she believed him. And what about the cost? He opened his eyes and met her gaze. I've learned there is such a thing as too far. I don't have an answer for you. She reached up and touched his face. He was being so incredibly honest with her, it touched in a way she never dreamed possible. She brought his lips to hers and gave them the barest of touches. Electricity like she'd never felt before sizzled through her. Her eyes shot open and she stared at him in surprise. He stared at her similarly. And then he spun on his heel, taking her hand and pulling her along behind him back to their quarters. As soon as they were through the door, he shouted, "What else does your tech do?" Marcus spun like he'd been slapped and stared at him in bewilderment. "Nothing. I mean, things, but I don't understand. Would it cause a blouse-a-can?" Everyone's eyes shot open wide as they stared between Charles and Gail. She had no idea what they were talking about. "No," Marcus said quietly. "If the blouse-a-can has been initiated, it's not my doing." "Tech?" Gail asked. "That's how we discovered you were an OM breeder," Charles said, his tone saying he wasn't paying any attention to the words coming out of his mouth. "It was something I developed with another team," Marcus said. "It has to do with the OM and you have it, so we had questions that I'm hoping we have answers to now." Charles shook his head. "We soon will." "Okay, great." Marcus bounced on his toes. Derek rose to his feet, studying Gail through his narrowed dark, almond-shaped eyes. "Are you sure?" Charles nodded once. "What is he talking about?" Gail asked. Charles growled, then stormed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him. Derek released a long sigh. The blouse-a-can is the life bond between soul mates. His late wife and him were connected in this way, so everyone assumed he wouldn't experience another one again after she died. A thread of fear rippled through her. Was she killed on Ilion? Derek nodded, his dark eyes shining with a little respect. But a connection like this between a Grimm and a human? Because we're less than. Joey stood, his eagle eyes piercing her soul. Not less than, but more ruthless. "We didn't destroy an entire race." "We didn't destroy them," Derek said, his voice lacking any emotion. "We imprisoned them for what was supposed to be a short period of time. Their government was made aware of the situation and were willing to support our actions. And that makes it better?" Nothing about any of it made anything better. One race desperate to save the lives of their people, pushed into a desperate move in order to keep their line and their species from dying. Another desperate to maintain a world that had rightfully been theirs to begin with. And a man who lost everything while having control of none of it. She just wanted to help these 5 men in any way she could. She just didn't know if she had what it took to give them what they needed. They needed more than a woman with a womb with the ability to carry their young. They needed something to give them hope. She wasn't sure she was the right person for that job. Chapter 7. Gail spent the rest of that evening trying to get to know her 5 boys. However, they had all closed ranks on her. It wasn't that they treated her badly. They simply had things to do and she wasn't it. This was getting ridiculous. Her hormones were raging, and every time she looked at one of them she wanted to explode. And what did they do? Ignore her at every chance. Was she not attractive enough for them? Was her being awakened a problem? She had to get to the bottom of this. If nothing else, so she could go home. Did they want her to go home? She needed to ask them. She left the common room and went to their individual quarters. When she tried to talk to Joey, he shied away from her, as though he was fearful of what might happen if he even looked at her. Frustrated, she stalked off to hang out with Derek, hoping she could learn something about their group from him. However, as soon as he saw her, he closed the door to the room he was in, shutting her out. Marcus was nowhere to be found, and Kirk was missing too. Charles wasn't going to be any help in this situation. He was already unhappy about her being here. Huffing, she went back to the main area. She paced the common room. Every time she approached one of them, they turned away. She couldn't understand why. What had she done to them? She was here to help their species. At least, that's what she told herself. Her men weren't helping her help themselves though. Gail let out an annoyed sigh and looked around the room. Empty. With nothing better to do, she went back to her sleeping area. These two races really were no better than humans. Fighting for control. Genocide. No better than what was going on today. Gail and her friends had always joked that aliens would never come to Earth because of the way people treated each other on the planet. Turned out, unless she could keep her memories, they would never realize how wrong they were. The aliens they joked about were just as bad as they were. Worse, in some cases. She looked around the room, so sterile. She longed for her bedroom. Her comforter, bed, dresser. Even her clothes. She would kill for some pants, a shirt. A bra. She'd ask one of the guys about it, maybe Marcus. He was the smallest of them after all. Maybe he would have a shirt she could borrow, too. That was if she could get him to talk to her. If she could get any of them to talk to her. She kept circling back to one thing. They were like humans. Did that mean that they were also like human males in the way to their hearts was through their stomachs? She would have to find out. But, what did they like to eat? She had seen them eating the same food as her, but she figured that was too bland and better. What did they truly enjoy eating? Could she find it on Earth? Was it in the kitchen? Frustrated, she flopped down on the bed and picked at the colorless bed covering. White. Everything in here was small and white. Had it been like this each time they took her? She closed her eyes and tried to remember her other rooms. But there were no memories of rooms. Just memories of men. Lots of men. And those people in sterile jackets. She grabbed her pillow and screamed as she laid on the bed. Tonight was a bust. She needed sleep. Opening her eyes, she stared at the ceiling and forced her mind to slow before closing her eyes again. Maybe things would be better in the morning. Chapter 9. Charles couldn't believe he'd found another woman with whom he had a connection with, a Blausican. When his wife had died, he had thought he'd never find another woman like her again. Gail wasn't like her, but how many people could claim a Blausican with multiple partners? It was true he wasn't monogamous. He'd never claimed to be, even when he'd been with his wife. And neither had she been. It just hadn't been demanded or expected. But at the end of the day, they would always return to one another. The problem was that he just didn't see anything in Gail he could claim as a true mate, an equal. Yes. She'd just been awakened. And, yes, she was still just discovering her way. But where was the fire? Where was the demand to be more? He just didn't see that. And the Grimm needed each person to be their best. He just didn't see what else she could be other than a baby maker. She couldn't even carry her child to term, which wasn't her fault. But it just gave him one more thing to ask about. What was she really doing? And what was this connection really about? He dove into his work, studying the algorithms on their shielding, looking for areas of improvement. The boys filtered in and out of their work area, none of them saying a thing about Gail. He wasn't sure that was a comfort or not. But they were close on the shield. Well, they discovered something they were sure would help. He wasn't even sure the OM knew about that weakness, but he'd exploit it. Zapra stepped into the common room. He was the only one there at the moment. He looked up at her and groaned internally. It was unusual for her to make a personal appearance. Is something the matter? The expression on her face said there was. I need to know why the breeder hasn't been impregnated yet. She's scheduled to go back in the next few hours. What was he supposed to say? Need more time. Zapra narrowed her eyes. Charles knew he could get the time they needed. All they had to do was increase the time differential surrounding their pod sets. Why? He was tempted to tell her what Marcus and Joey had done, but he realized what a grave mistake that would be. Not only would they lose this project, but they would be sent back to their dying planet without a hope of being relocated elsewhere. That threat had been a very real one. "We're just warming up to the idea of it, is all. We will have the task completed promptly. Make it happen." She walked up to their security console and stared at their prisoners. "What are you going to do with them?" "I don't know yet." "Do we know anything about them?" How much could he tell her without letting it slip that they'd overrode Gail's inhibitor? "They're posing as our breeder's neighbors." "Do we know why?" He did, but should he tell her? Yes. It was a matter of security. "She is also an breeder." Zapra blinked but didn't look surprised. That pissed him off a little. "You knew." "Of course I did. That's what makes her such a good breeder. What you don't know is that she contains 5 other chromosomes for other species across our galaxy. She could be a breeder on many planets." He let that sink in for a moment. The level of risk they were under. Imagine the possibilities. Her genes have been transferring to most of her young. That means that our people, her descendants, could go almost anywhere in our galaxy. If war came here, if we found ourselves pushed out here, 1 in 8 of her children could live and reproduce elsewhere. Our race could continue. He hadn't even thought of that possibility. And the According to our records, they're just starting their breeder farms, but there's nothing that states they're actively looking for more breeders. But we took this one. Zapra paused and turned toward him. She is special. She is very rare. We haven't found anyone like her on any of the other planets. At least, not according to our latest communications. That made him only want to protect her more, which was irrational. He'd just finished telling himself that he wanted nothing to do with her. What did this connection to her mean? There is something more going on here. That hadn't been a question. Charles swallowed. He had to be very careful of what he said. "We touched and there was a connection." "A connection? A Blausican?" He nodded. Her eyes sparked with interest as she tipped her head to the side. "And the others? How are they responding to this?" He didn't know what to say without telling her everything. "Things are interesting." Zapra turned back to the monitor that showed the 2 I know what Marcus and Joey did. Charles froze. "I was going to send the 2 of them back, but now." She folded her hands behind her back and hopped on her toes. "I wonder if perhaps it wasn't the right thing to do." "I see." He really didn't. "She won't be able to retain her memories on the outside," Zapra warned. "That will be too dangerous. So the device will be reinitiated and her memories will be wiped again." "And when she comes back?" Zapra shook her head. "I don't know. This is a security concern I never anticipated. Your team were never meant to be breeders, Charles. There's too much disobedience in her genes. Then, why did you assign us to her if she's so important?" She turned to him and raised her chin, meeting his gaze squarely. "The decision was made without my input and my thoughts on the matter were overridden." That was rather humbling. She looked away. "Impregnate her so we can move forward with her. But do so quickly. She will be back within 1 week to have the fetus transplanted, and then another 3 for reimpregnation." He blinked, not quite sure how to handle the information he'd been dealt. He'd always assumed he'd been brought to Earth because he had value. That they'd all been brought to Earth because they had value. Zapra must have read that on his face. Her lips tightened, but her eyes drooped with a touch of sadness. "Earth is our worst hope. I am here because it needs someone strong enough to make this stronghold last. But know this. The people here are what we could afford. They weren't the best our race had to offer. She didn't say anything else as she turned and left the room. Charles stood in stunned silence, letting the knowledge sink in. That was a little harsh, Gail's soft voice said behind him. He jerked but didn't turn to her. How long have you been standing there? For a while. I saw she was here, so I decided to stay hidden. I don't think I like her too much. Charles was starting to feel the same way. So, look. Gail came to stand beside him. I know that you and I didn't get to a great start. That was an understatement. But I'm not useless. I'm an ER nurse in the real world. She stopped herself with a jerk, surprise filling her expression. I never thought I'd say that out loud. But anyway. I also play a lot of games, the combat kind. So, how about you let me in? He really didn't think that was a good idea. She touched his arm lightly, and their connection sizzled through him. I know I need to prove myself to you. I can feel you. Somehow. I don't know how. It's just really weird. He narrowed his eyes and studied her, seeing her as if for the first time. She'd changed her clothes. She wore someone's pants, could have been Marcus's actually, as he was the smallest of the men on his team, and a shirt that was cinched at the waist with a makeshift belt. Her long, rich hair was pulled back in a ponytail, which was probably severe, but it just made her pale blue eyes stand out even more. She looked like she was taking this seriously, like she wanted to be more than a baby maker. And that was alluring. He was reminded in that moment of the first time he'd seen her. He didn't know why that image popped into his head. But he compared the woman standing before him now to that doll and his loins surged with need. She raised her full, dark eyebrows. So, here's what I'm thinking. She stepped up to the monitors. The OM and the Grimm are at war. We know that. We also know that the Grimm, well, that woman, thinks very highly of herself and that they're still under the radar. He was interested to hear where this was going. She turned to him. They're not. I know it for a fact. The number of alien sightings and the stories of people who think they've been abducted are rising. And people are talking about this on more than just the boogeyman boards. They're talking about it in real life, to their friends, to anyone that will listen. But most of those people are discredited. She shook her head. No. Well, publicly, yes. Of course. Look at who we have as president. He wouldn't have it any other way. He just wants money for his stupid wall. But whatever. They're gathering real people around them who are willing to take them seriously. How real was this information? Like my gynecologist. Who also happens to be my best friend. But, whatever. It was like this was the first time she'd really come out of her shell. She was talking without any shields or wards or barriers up. She was animated. She was alive. And every nerve in his body was paying attention. She didn't even seem to notice his attraction. She is working with me to get to the bottom of my pregnancies. She's running tests. She's close to something. She found something the last time, but someone came through and ruined the test results. So this time, she's going to be a little more covert. That's one person. She shook her head. I'm not the only one and neither is she. Gail looked around and then perched on the edge of the console table. She knows others who have come to her or to other colleagues about this. She's trying to collect them all, but they're from all over the world. They're talking about this. And they're catching on to the fact that someone doesn't want them to talk about it. Sandy's worried. And they think there's an invasion. And if that information gets leaked, people are going to end up dead. If this is the government covering this up. It probably was. then they're just going to make people disappear to make the story go away. And they have the power to do that. That sounds like a conspiracy theory. Which is what the majority of people say, but what happens when someone comes out with proof? What happens when the OM realize that the best way to get to you is to let the truth be known? He hadn't thought of that. It's an endgame decision. If this was a game, the OM would be in the government. They'd be in the schools. They'd be in the utilities. She smashed her lips flat for a moment and looked up at him. They'd be here. No, that's not possible. Really? Because they're here and you didn't know they were OM. Maybe Gail had a bit more value than he'd originally thought. Maybe she was more than just a special breeder and the savior of their race. Maybe she was the one who could keep the Grimm secure on this planet. And she was his mate. Chapter 10. Gail needed to know if the real Bess and Eric were alive. She knew what Charles would say. It didn't matter, but to her it did. They were real people who didn't deserve to get mixed up in the middle of her mess. She didn't deserve to get mixed up in this mess, but that was beyond her control. She refused to believe that Bess and Eric were as well. But that brought up other things, too. Sandy. When Gail got back out there, she needed to stop the tests. She needed Sandy to stop collecting data and blood samples and to stop running tests because that would bring the OM to her, if it hadn't already. Sandy's life was in danger. And Gail didn't know how she'd be able to handle it if Sandy was murdered all because she'd been trying to help. Gail found Derek in their common lab. That was the only thing she could call it. He was busy studying screens. She went up to him. He flinched at her arrival as if she'd jolted him out of a deep concentration. He glared at her to cover the reaction. "I need your help," she said, keeping it brief. Everything she read from his nonverbals said he wasn't the type of guy who appreciated long conversations. He grunted. She took that to mean he wanted to know what she needed. There was something sexy about a simple-spoken man. "The OM who you captured are pretending to be my neighbors. I need to know if the real Bess and Eric are alive or if they're in trouble." That got his attention. He stared at her with his dark, almond-shaped eyes. She didn't know Eastern Asian cultures well enough to know what country he looked to be from. Though, that was probably moot since he was an alien who only looked like he came from this planet. He was damned gorgeous. She could say that. Under his loose-fitting green tunic, she could almost see the muscles. He moved with a grace that only came with power and practice. She found it hard to focus on the task at hand. Her mind wanted to travel along other paths. The paths that led to Derek's clothes being on the floor and having him naked and tied to a bed while she had her way with him. She could almost see the fire in his eyes, what they would look like as they stared up at her, wanting and willing. But she couldn't think along those lines. Her real neighbors needed her. And she needed real answers. "What do you know about them?" Derek asked finally, turning toward one of his screens. She told him everything she knew. Bessa's parents lived close by. She refused to live anywhere far away because she needed to take care of them. They were getting older and weren't doing really well. They were too wealthy to ask for financial aid and too poor to be able to get the help they needed. Gail had met Bessa's parents many times over the past few years. Bess had tried to take Gail in, but something had held her back. Something always did. Eric, on the other hand, was a lot less chatty or open. He let Gail borrow his lawn mower every week, but that, really, was the extent of their relationship. Bess didn't tell her much about him either. She'd met his younger brother, but she couldn't remember his name. That was enough for Derek. He was good at what he did. "What is it that you do?" Gail asked finally. "Lead security." "Well, that's certainly fit." Derek read the information on his screen. Gail tried to read over his shoulder, but he was a speed reader and that was one thing she'd never mastered. Finally, he turned to her. I can send out a small team. To what? Gail wasn't sure what he would think enough would be. Find them. Rescue them. Kill them. To locate them. And then what? He studied her with his dark eyes. What are you doing here, Gail? That was a really stupid question. I'm here to get pregnant because, apparently, that's what I am. A baby maker. He shook his head. Why are you here? With him. What was she supposed to do? How many other women did she know of who could just walk into a group of 5 guys and have sex with each of them and have everyone be all right with that? In the ER, she had run across more than her fair share of sexual emergencies, and it was always interesting to see the partner who brought them in. But, this went past everything she knew was socially acceptable. But she still didn't care about that. What she did care about was not hurting any of her men. Her men. Wow. She'd come a long way in so short a time. But the best way to get through to Derek was to be honest with him. She really didn't have a problem with that. Usually, people told her she was a little too honest. This is my life now. He nodded, but continued to wait. I need to make sure that the people in my life are safe. If she was the reason they died, then what? She'd feel horrible about it, but what could she do about it? If Bess and Eric are being held against their will. If they're dead. Then, I don't know. But they're not the only friend I have. He narrowed his gaze and nodded once, turning away from her. He punched the screen a few times, typing something. And then he turned back to her. I have a feeling they're being held in one of 2 known OM locations. Wait. You know where they might be? He raised his dark eyebrows as if to ask her why he wouldn't. They like to take the people they're going to impersonate to these locations in order to gain information about them. They study them so it's easier to impersonate. And if they fail, then the people around them who they're closest with end up dead. Oh. Which is what happened with the OM impersonating Eric, Derek said. His parents both died in a car accident where their car fell into a ravine and his oldest sister ended up in a coma that she might not wake up from. When? Gail couldn't believe that. She hadn't heard about any of it. 3 months ago. 3 months? That meant that the real Bess and Eric had been the people she'd originally met. She hadn't been duped into liking the OM impersonators. That meant her real friends were in trouble. He nodded. I'm sending a team out there now, but you need to understand something. His tone said she wasn't going to like what he was about to say. Our commander amended the order to a kill order. What? Why? This couldn't be happening. She'd wanted to save her friends. Not get them killed. Because, he said simply, rising to his feet. There's no way of getting them out without tipping our hand or our location. Deaths can be made to look accidental. They're not. You're committing murder. I'm trying to keep us safe. Keep, he clenched his jaw and took her arms, moving her out of the way. You safe. Keeping her safe. By killing her friends. Are there other friends who might be in danger? He asked. If this was the protection he offered. No, but as soon as she got out, she was going to tell Sandy to stop. She couldn't risk losing another friend. She'd barely known Eric. Bess, she'd known a little better, but Gail had never gone out of her way to make the friendship work. That still didn't make her feel any better. She wanted to punch him, to strike out at him. She didn't realize she had until her palm tingled with the pain of her slap. She looked up at him surprised. He didn't seem fazed at all. He just raised a single eyebrow, as if asking if she was done. Growling low, she hit him again, this time on his arm with her fist. He grabbed her, holding her close, his eyes shining with an inner fire. "Be mad," he said low, his voice walking along her nerves, setting each one ablaze. "Kindle that fire in your gut and stay alive." He wanted her fire kindled, did he? Well, she could bring that. She broke out of his embrace and kicked his leg out from under him. He fell like a tree, hitting the floor with a grunt. She was an ER nurse. She'd taken a few self-defense classes in order to keep herself protected. She'd had to. She wasn't going to risk becoming another statistic, another nurse hurt by a raging asshole in pain or high on drugs. He was on his feet with a single push. He didn't give her a second to think about it. He assaulted her, but not in the way she was prepared for. His calloused hands gripped her face, his fingers digging into the back of her head, keeping her right where he wanted her. His lips crashed onto hers, claiming her and teasing her lips open. Her fingers raked against his skin, clawing at his clothes. She needed a release. Anything. She hadn't realized until that moment just how uptight she'd been since she'd arrived. She'd been kidnapped, used against her will, and awakened only to discover that anyone she cared about were in danger. And she didn't know who the greater threat was. The OM or her men. She pushed her tongue forward, exploring the recesses of his mouth, savoring the taste of him. Her body inflamed as his lips left hers and marched their way along her jaw and down her neck to the base of her throat. He pushed her against the console, propping her there, giving her a better place to continue her own assault of him. She needed more. Her body was on fire and her need was engorged. With the deft fingers of an ER nurse who knew how to remove clothing in a matter of seconds, she removed his tunic, laying his chest bare to her. He groaned, watching her, assessing her. That's when she saw it. His hesitation. He was just as unsure what to do in that moment as she was. She'd make this simple. She had to mate in order to be released and sent back to her friend, to help save and protect Sandy. So, that's exactly what she would do. It helped that he was so incredibly hot. She opened his belt and worked his fly. The door opened, a cool breeze whooshing over her. Her hands stopped and heat rose to her cheeks. Charles stood in the doorway, watching them with an intense gaze. He looked away and went to the security console. "We need to talk." Derek didn't move except to breathe. "Finally," he said, "we're in the middle of something." "I see that. And it's something we need to do. It's something I need to do." Wait. Was he even going to ask first? "And the rest of us?" Charles tipped his head to the side and said one word. "Blouse can." Derek paused for a moment, and then snatched up his shirt. He redid his fly over his large bulge and slipped his shirt back on. "What do you need?" "I saw the kill order," Charles said. "I'm amending it." A thrill of excitement rushed through Gail. She didn't want to speak, didn't want to ruin it. But there was hope for her friends. "You can't override Zapra," Derek said. "Not without consequence." Charles met Gail's eyes. This was a bad time to wake her. Derek relaxed finally, but only minutely. Any time would have been bad. Gail couldn't agree. She didn't want to think about what her life had been like as a doll. She still didn't remember a lot of it and she didn't want to. But she was glad to have a little choice back. "I'm glad she is, though," Derek said. That made her like him a little more. "And the kill order needs to stand." Derek's eyes tipped with sadness. "The protection of our people is more important than two individuals." And just like that, she was back to not liking him. It didn't mean he wouldn't be one fantastic hook, but she didn't like him. How could he be that cold? "And if those individuals were us?" Charles asked. Zapra would issue the same command, only she would have done so sooner. Charles nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. He seemed desperate. For what? For her to understand. For her not to run. If you do this, you risk being sent back, Derek said. I know, was all Charles said. Then, he dropped her gaze and started tapping on the screen. Wait. Was he just signing his death warrant? Chapter 11. Derek stormed out of the room, leaving Gail standing there, watching Charles sign his life away. Stop, she said. He didn't answer and continued to tap on the screen. She didn't know how many taps it would take to end his life. She went to him and stopped him, her hand on his arm. He finally met her gaze, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw uncertainty. What are you doing? She asked. The right thing. That's when it hit her. The right thing wasn't so easy to see anymore. Was it right to ask these people to endanger their lives because of her? Was it any more right that two people who barely knew her were in a prison because of her, that their lives were about to end because of her? Charles and his team were among a species who were being hunted to the point of extinction, whose planet was dying. What would she do in a situation like that? Would she risk all of her people over too? She was an ER nurse. She fought the battles to keep people alive, but she also knew how to make the tough call, how to shoulder that burden. Yes. The doctors did most of that, but there were a lot fewer doctors than there were nurses, and she was the front line. She took his hand away from the screen. What are the chances of them actually saving Bess and Eric? He shook his head. Slim. Slim. So, even if she pushed to save them, there was a very strong likelihood that it wouldn't even happen. The OM are strong, Gail, Charles said. They care less about the lives of those outside their own species. This is. The defenses would have to be taken down. Our team would have to take down the security grid. Wouldn't they have to do that anyway just to get in? No, Charles met her gaze again. They're already inside, using the tech the OM have. We're using it against them. So, extracting them would blow the cover of your agents on the inside. He nodded. And destroy any advantage we have. She shook her head. And you would save them and go back to your dying planet? He didn't respond for a long moment. Being this close to him, breathing his breath and feeling the warmth of his body against hers, she was pulled into him, her soul was. It was as if she was a boat on an ocean of emotion and he was her anchor. We're connect, you and I. I feel what this means to you. I don't know what to do, she whispered. I do. His tone was solid. Sacrifice your life for theirs. Or theirs for your entire people's. He nodded. I know which I would choose. So, you're throwing away the safety of your people because of me. That pissed her off. She didn't want the safety of his entire people to rest on her shoulders. It was one thing to carry their babies. It was an entirely different thing to be the singular reason they all ended up dead. Yes. He raised his chin, studying her as if he noticed the subtle change in her demeanor and found it interesting. She ground her teeth. I can't be the one to make this decision. It will be made because of you. Which life should she choose? Then, if this was the ER, what would she do? Bess and Eric were the least likely to survive. They would need resources that just weren't available. And to save them would endanger the lives of others she could save. Don't, she heard herself say. Her heart raced as she realized the full impact of what she'd just done. She'd allowed the death warrant to remain on the heads of two of her friends. No. On two people she barely knew. She had no idea who Bess really had been. Maybe she was a good person. Maybe she wasn't. They are being held in a facility, Charles said softly, of a mind frame. She didn't even know what that meant. They're in a virtual reality. They don't even know they're taken. I can assure you of that. That made things a little easier. Maybe. She blinked, fighting the urge to scream or run or beat on someone. Which reminded her that he'd caught her nearly having sex with Derek. How does, she gestured to the console he'd found her leaning against. This work? He shrugged. We're all polyamorous. So, we're fine with sharing you, as long as you understand that we will sometimes share one another and other women. Each other. Now, that was a turn she hadn't expected. Your human race is peculiar about sex, he said quietly. We are not. There is a reason we were created to enjoy the act, and it wasn't to hide in shame from it. Well, when he said it that way. But because of our connection, I will have you first. And will you? She asked. Because it seems as though the thought of taking me leaves a bad taste in your mouth. He gave her a frank look. It's because I'm told I must. Because, in this, I am nothing more than a stud. Yeah, well, she said, understanding exactly what he felt. Try being the womb. He grunted and offered her hand. Come. We need to talk strategy. It meant a lot that he intended to keep her in the loop. She took his hand and followed him into another common room, this one she'd never seen before. However, it looked like the others. Opulent yet sedated. There were lounging chairs and couches spread around the room, and one large table that dominated the area. Charles gestured for the guys to join them at the table. Marcus brought over another chair for her to sit. What's going on? Derek glared at the table. This wasn't going to be great and it wouldn't work. They might be polyamorous, and they might think that sharing her was going to be fine, but there were dynamics to their relationship that none of them knew quite how to handle. Charles held out a hand, palm down in Derek's direction. It's fine. Derek relaxed a little. Charles let his hand fall and looked at each of them in turn. Zapra knows about Gail. Joey went still. Marcus's eyes widened almost comically. Derek took in a breath and then held it for a moment. Kirk just frowned, which was an odd thing to see. His face was better for smiling. What does that mean? Gail asked because seeing their reactions wasn't helping her. That means, Joey said, his voice a bare whisper, that I'm going back. No, Charles said. It doesn't. That was her original intent, but once she learned of the Blausacan, she changed her mind. Marcus's pale eyes darted around the room. Really? Charles nodded. Yes. Gail is a very special breeder. Oh, that just filled Gail with so much joy. Great. Charles shrugged. You're able to breed with several of the species. If we were forced to abandon Earth, we could take you with us and continue to breed more children. What? Take her with them. To other planets. With or without my permission. He didn't answer. Because of that, her memory wipe will be reinitiated. No, Gail couldn't let that happen. She couldn't. Without her memories, she'd have no way of protecting Sandy. She'd have no way of saving herself. She'd go back to the same old questions. She'd see that something was wrong. She'd feel pregnant again, and she would go back to Sandy, and plead for her to run more tests. Joey stared at her with his eagle eyes and crossed his arms over his chest. It would be best. No, Gail said vehemently. It would not. She's asking questions, Derek said, gesturing at her with one hand. When she's out there. The memory wipe isn't enough. If we leave the device intact, if we allow it to continue to wipe her mind, then she will continue to put our lives in danger. He's right. What argument could she use to keep her memories, to save Sandy? She couldn't risk telling them about her. They might issue a kill order on her. Or Sandy might already be OM. She might already be impersonated. I need a way to test for OM impersonators. Joey tipped his head to the side, a look of shock filling his sharp features. That would be wise. But only if we could find a way to unlock her memories when she's outside, Marcus said. And I think I know how. Charles nodded once. Do that. When you're on the outside, you have to act as though you don't remember. You're going to have to keep quiet about all of this. Gail nodded. Except with Sandy. Sandy, she was going to warn. Sandy was going to learn everything in order to keep her safe. That was one thing Gail wouldn't budge on. But if Sapra knows, Joey said, and if she insists on wiping Gail's mind, then we need to find something that will keep the wipe from working. Marcus bit his lips and shook his head. It means that we have to leave a back door inside her mind. What? I don't think I like that idea. A back door inside her mind? No. It's like programming a backdoor into a program, Marcus said. But it needs to be something you'll do. What? None of this was making any sense. You know what you do when you get back. Whatever you do every time, that is what I will set as the trigger to gain your memories back. You'll set the trigger, and then the protocols will unlock, and your memories will come back. That sounded easy enough. That is tricky, Joey said. Wouldn't it be easier to override the wipe? Marcus shook his head. To override that, I would need access to the wipe equipment. I don't have that clearance, but I do have access to the chip inside of her head. She hated that, knowing there was something inside her body that could override her at any time. Okay. Charles tapped the table with his fingers. What do you do every time? So many things. I get up. I turn off the alarm clock. Marcus shook his head. No. It has to be something bigger. Not your daily routine. A chill washed over her. The thing she did every single time was the very reason she needed her memories in the first place. Should she tell them? Could she trust them? What? Derek asked, straightening. She had to tell them something. Just, maybe, not everything. I make a phone call. Marcus shook his head and opened his mouth. Charles raised a hand to stop him. To who? She swallowed. My gynecologist. She licked her bottom lip anxiously. Damn, she was a bad poker player. And schedule a pregnancy test. Derek closed his eyes and fell slowly back into his chair. Joey rubbed his temple. Kirk just looked around the table, not quite understanding the significance of what was said. Marcus lit up. That would do it. Charles leaned forward. Is your gynecologist a threat? Fear closed Gail's throat. Unlike Bess, Sandy was a real friend. Are you going to kill her? Derek looked over at Charles, and then tipped his head. Charles didn't seem to notice. Is she a threat? Maybe, she whispered. She couldn't hide the threat from him even it was to save her friend's life. She'd find another way. Gail would keep Sandy safe one way or another. Charles seemed to understand all of what she said and didn't say. Maybe it was the connection. She didn't know. He nodded and then turned to Marcus. Make it happen. Her emotions high, Gail sat there, listening to the men, her men, talk about other security risks and their project. She was going to save Sandy. She just had to come up with a plan to make that happen. Chapter 12. There wasn't anything else she could learn there. She had the information she needed. The only thing she needed was for Marcus and Joey to figure out how to fix her mind-wipe gadgets. She had to remember. What will this backdoor look like? She asked Marcus. They were alone in the lab. He shrugged. It should just be a simple communication loop and then you remember. Should be. Shaking his head, he set down a tool that made metal smoke. I don't know. Honestly, I don't even know if this is going to work. Great. Well, it has to. What aren't you telling me? She shook her head. I can't, she swallowed. She couldn't afford to lose anyone else. You have someone out there who's in danger, don't you? She didn't answer. Damn it. He clenched his hand into a fist. How many people are you talking to out there about this? Not that many. Geez. When he said it like that, it was like him telling her she was a gossip. So, there is someone. Could she trust him? Yes. He thought about that for a moment and then nodded, returning to his work. I'll get this ready. I will. How long? I don't know. Well, Charles said, stepping into the lab behind her. We don't have a lot of time. Gail turned to him. Why not? What happened? His gaze buried themselves into her soul. Zappa arrived again. We're out of time. Which meant she had to sleep with one of them and hope she got pregnant. Now. And, by the look on Charles's face, he was her man. She enjoyed sex, but when she was told she was going to have it and with whom, it kind of took a little of the thrill out of it. He turned to leave, but stopped on the other side of the door, extending his hand. They were just as much screwed by this situation as she was. She took his hand and mouthed, "Hurry up," over her shoulder. Marcus grunted. And then the door closed. Charles led her into the sleeping quarters and to a room she hadn't been in before. It was like peering inside his soul. There were so many instruments. Some she recognized. Others she didn't. Do you play all of these? He smiled, embarrassed. Now, that was a side of him she never got to see. I do. I've always had a natural gift for it. She walked into the room and touched a few of the instruments. He had stringed instruments of varying sizes. Wind instruments. There were several made from metals she couldn't even begin to put a name to. Which one is your favorite? His dark brows shot up and a smile softened his features as he scanned the room. He went to a series of shelves on the back wall and touched one. It was made of something that was black until the light hit it, and then a rainbow array of colors lit up the surface. It's called a hesk. It's used mostly on the planet Hydra. It's on the other side of the galaxy from here. The room had two sofas, one larger than the other, both blue. The large bed dominated the other half of the room. She ignored it for the moment and perched on the larger sofa. Will you play it for me? He glanced at her, his dark eyes filled with emotions she couldn't easily name. But they were softer than the ones he normally shared. He grabbed it off the shelf and walked toward her. It's not often I get to share these with anyone. What about your past wife? He flattened his lips, though the corners rose in a smile as he shook his head. This was never anything she was interested in. Saving the world. Yes. Investigating life and how to continue it. Yes. But music? No. For her, it was always a waste of time. Well, for Gail, it wasn't. Music is a way for humans to bond. She gestured for him to join her. He did, sinking onto the other end of the couch. Let's see what you think of this one. He brought the instrument to his lips, and the most amazing music she'd ever heard came out of it. The song he played touched her heart, calling on her sadness and grief. It was as if he was playing directly to her soul, sharing his pain and loss, his fear of finding hope in a new world, of knowing how quickly that hope could be snuffed out. She didn't realize the music had even stopped until she felt his hand on the side of her face. His dark eyes filled with lust, and something more. He needed to know hope again. He needed the spark to light his soul and let him feel again. That was something she could understand. He must have saw it in her eyes. His lips descended to hers, firm, yet undemanding. He asked permission. She granted it, pressing hers to his, molding their lips together, parting her lips against his. He groaned at her invitation, delving his tongue into her mouth, exploring her warmth. His fingers dug into her hair, refusing to let her go. She pushed against his chest, desperate to feel his skin, needing to remove his clothes. All these delicious men and their taunting kisses had wreaked havoc on her body. She'd been forcing the lust away, but now, in this moment, she didn't need to. She let instinct lead her, ignoring her mind telling her this wasn't right. Mind be damned. She needed this now. He broke the kiss, pulling away from her. She reached for him, her fingers itching to touch him. He smiled, a slight cockiness to it. He was enjoying her torment. She bit her lip as he reached for the hem of his shirt, slowly inching it up, revealing his abs slowly. Her fingers twitched in anticipation of what he would feel like under them. Her mouth watered. She wanted to lick him from head to toe. She squeezed her thighs together as a strangled moan escaped her throat. He chuckled. "You are a little vixen, aren't you?" She reached for him, her fingers itching to under his pants and release the bulge she could see growing below his waistband. Instead, she got her hands swatted away and he stepped back, shaking his head at her. He slowly kicked off his boots, one by one, before hovering his hand over his belt. "Is this what you want me to remove?" She couldn't move, she was close to bursting. He stood there, his hand above his buckle, waiting for her to respond. She blinked, breaking his spell, and looked up at him through her eyelashes, and gave one short nod of her head. Chapter 13. Gail was content. She knew that as soon as she left the bed, people would come along and take her away. She wasn't ready for that. Morning came too soon. She found herself pinned under one of his arms, her leg intertwined with his. A blanket over them that hadn't been there when she fell asleep, their scent surrounding her. She didn't want to get up, but she knew she had to. Moving his arm up, she slid out from under him. He rolled over as she was slipping her shirt on. The expression on his face was hard to read. "Leaving already?" She shrugged. "We can't hold it off much longer, can we?" He shook his head, but his face said he didn't like this any more than she did. He stopped himself. She turned to him, pausing in her search for pants. If what? She wanted a solution. Any solution. Because this. Being with him, with them. It felt like she belonged finally. He shook his head. Nothing. He sighed and got out of bed. When they were both dressed, they headed back into the common areas, locating the rest of the boys in the dining room. There wasn't a single ounce of jealousy, even though she could tell they all realized what she and Charles had done. Derek even motioned for her to come sit beside him for breakfast. "How close are you?" Charles asked. Joey shook his head, looking as serious as always. "We need more time." "You don't have that." "No kidding," Marcus said grumpily. "Maybe it didn't take," Gail offered. Kirk shook his head, his normal smile completely absent. "They give you drugs or hormones or something so that one time is all it takes." "They're very efficient," Joey agreed, his eagle eyes staring a hole in his cup. "What does that mean, then?" Gail asked. She had to know. Would she have enough memories to save her friend or not? "For my memories. When they come to get me, what will I be able to remember?" Marcus scratched his head, distressed. "I don't know. I do know we have the back door installed. It's just. I don't know how much we'll be able to unlock for you." So, what? This wasn't good. This was far from good. "I've installed a tracker with the back door." She had no idea why that came out as more of a question than a statement. "And?" And Marcus pulled his head forward, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. If you get into trouble, we'll come get you. We'll come. Charles thumped the table with his fist, staring up at the ceiling above him. He lowered his head. And Zapra? Marcus shrugged. We ran out of time and this was the best I could do. The best he could do. This wasn't enough, not if she was going to save Sandy's life. Charles met her gaze, silent and pensive. Shit. The door behind them opened. The boys stood, everyone except for Marcus and Charles. Gail swallowed hard and rose, turning toward the men who had entered. There were two of them, tall, their skin almost a little blue, and they were dressed in white uniforms. You're ready, the one on her left said with a smile. If you'll follow us, please. Where are we going? The corners of his smile dipped a little as he frowned at her. Zapra did tell us you'd awakened. That's unregular. The other man grunted. Let's just get this over with. You're going back home. Back to your old life. She was going to call him grumpy. It was a lot nicer than some of the other things she wanted to call him. Fine. Are you going to wipe my memories? Mr. Smiles nodded. You'll be safe, though. No harm will come to you. And when I return, will I get my memories back? Mr. Smiles blinked at Grumpy. It doesn't work that way. When you're wiped, the memories disappear. She knew differently. She still had ghost memories of the times before. I want to remember. Mr. Smiles took her arm and led her gently out of the room. That's a security risk we simply cannot allow. She twisted to look at her boys one last time, trying to commit each face to her memory, trying to burn them into her brain so hard and so deep she'd never forget them. But then the door closed and all she had to see was an expanse of white walls and hallways. She lost count of the doors and hallways they walked through. One hallway overlooked the entire complex, nestled in the middle of the New Mexico desert. It wasn't really a desert. It was more like caked dirt plains. It was gorgeous, with all the circular buildings and spires and the domed roofs. A scene she wasn't going to remember. Grumpy tugged on her arm to get her moving again. Mr. Smiles stopped him. This part of your world reminds me a little of where I grew up. She looked up at him. On your world. He nodded. We were poor farmers. When my grandparents won their land, the dirt was still fertile, but by the time I came along, it was all dried up. It looks a lot like this now. She stared out over the horizon. Because of your son? I would assume so. What's it like? She asked. She didn't know if she was trying to buy the boys more time, or if she was trying to buy more awake time for herself. She didn't even know if her boys were still working on the issue, or if they even could. Hot. His smile dropped finally as he looked down. It's a sad thing to watch your planet die. I think we're watching ours die. He nodded. That can be reversed. Everything you've done to your planet can be erased. Well, kind of. It can be changed, softened. She gave him a ghost of a smile. Hope, then. He nodded again. She licked her lips and whispered, I don't want to forget. I have my orders, he said just as quietly. I'll protect you. And if you're found tortured? She didn't have an answer to that. I have to do what I'm ordered to. She understood that, but at the same time, she didn't. Do you know how many times I've been taken and impregnated by you or the OM? He nodded, licking his lips. I don't. She turned to face him squarely. But I remember parts of it. I remember the OM. I remember the Grim. I remember having my babies removed time after time after time. He glanced at Grumpy who had gone to the other end of the hall to wait for them. Do you know what would happen if you carried one of our children to term? She really didn't. You would die before you even had a chance to give birth. We're saving your life. And using it against my will. At least, with my memories, I can remember why this is a good thing, that I'm doing a good thing. Mr. Smiles clenched his jaw and looked away. And then I'll stop asking questions when I'm out there. He closed his eyes and sighed in resignation. That would help. I don't know how much longer we can keep covering this up for you. She knew it. Let me keep my memories and I'll stop asking questions. Finally, he met her gaze. I have to do at least a partial mind wipe so that you don't have our location or any key information about how to find us. Deal. He released another sigh and turned away. Fine. But tell no one. He led the way toward Grumpy. She followed them down 2 more halls and then an elevator. Finally, they arrived an area on the ground floor with several patient tables with operating stations set up near them. They scanned her to ensure she was indeed pregnant, and then took her to another room. There, she found the clothes she'd been brought in with. Her pajamas. She changed quickly. This had to work. This had to work. If it didn't, there was no sense in even going down that road of thought. It would work. She met Mr. Smiles just outside the door to her changing room. I'm ready. Okay. He was no longer smiling. He led her to a large, white machine, pushing her gently into the chair. Just sit there and remain calm. Right. Calm. That's when she realized that her heart rate was through the roof. She was anything but calm. She was about to freak out and that would be a bad thing. He used a syringe to inject pink liquid into her bloodstream. What was that? She asked. Something to help the memory wipe, but I cut it with something that should help block it, too. Should. He removed the syringe and wiped down the entry point with a cotton swab. This is the first time I've done anything like this, okay? So, when you first wake up, you shouldn't remember anything, but you will slowly start to get your memories back. Just, be patient. Be patient. Yes. He set the syringe down and brought over a helmet on a long arm. And then we'll see you again in a week to transfer the fetus. A week. Any longer and your life will be in danger. Great. How long before I get my memories back? He shook his head. I have no idea. A woman in a gray uniform came up next to her. You two seem awfully chatty. Gail recognized her as the woman from earlier, who'd spoken with Charles. Commander Zapra, Mr. Smiles said with a smile. She is awake and has questions. I was just putting her mind at ease. Zapra grunted in approval and then turned to Gail. And what thrilling heroics are you hoping to achieve once you get on the outside? Gail didn't like the way the helmet fit on her head. It wasn't painful or uncomfortable. It reminded her that her life wasn't in her control. I just want to live my life. Well, that we both agree with. Live your life. My entire life, Gail ground out. Zapra leaned down, putting her face in Gail's. That, I can't allow. You're a security risk if you remember too much. Gail shook her head. I'll stop asking questions. Oh, don't worry. You will be stopped. Zapra straightened and nodded to Mr. Smiles. When you're ready. Gail closed her eyes and fought. She wanted to remember. She had to remember. For her boys. For Sandy. For herself. A flash of white, blinding light hit her, so hard and so bright, she saw it through her eyelids. She clenched her hands, pulling on the armrests of the chair. She had to remember. She pulled up the last look she had from her boys as they sat at the dining table, watching her leave. Of the look on Charles's face as he was playing his instrument. Of the song he'd played her. What he looked like naked beside her. The look on Marcus's face when he was frustrated. The look on Derek's face when he kissed her. And then, there was nothing. She blinked and took in a deep breath, relaxing her fingers. She frowned, trying to remember what she'd been fighting so hard to remember. A woman in a gray uniform leaned down and smiled at her. I knew you would try and talk Samuel into helping you. He has such a soft heart. Trust me, Gail. Nothing he did nor anything your men did will help you remember a single thing about this place. What place? Gail looked around the room filled with patient tables. What were they doing there? She should be more scared, but she just couldn't work her way up to being scared. She just felt drained. The woman nodded to the man dressed in white beside her. Was he blue? He looked blue. Well, kind of blue. Not really blue. Just a little blue. Gail's head felt extremely heavy and all she wanted to do was to lay down and sleep. The man in white caught her as she slumped over. And, Samuel. Gail heard the woman say. Next time don't disappoint me. Of course, he said. He scooped Gail into his arms. I'm sorry, he whispered. She had no idea what he was even sorry for. Epilogue. Gail woke up, her alarm blaring the Superman theme song. She rolled over and turned it off. Sighing, she rolled back and threw her arm over her eyes. She wasn't ready for another Monday morning. Another shift at the ER. Another stream of people telling her she wasn't working fast enough or hard enough because they'd had to wait. She loved her job. She really did, but there were just times when she didn't. Time to get ready though. All through her shower and breakfast, it felt like something was wrong, like she was forgetting something. She'd already checked her phone 8 times to double-check she was on the right day. But that wasn't it. She checked her calendar to make sure she wasn't forgetting an appointment. She wasn't starting her new workout routine for another week yet. Maybe she was just getting excited for it. Who knew? But when she stood, her lower abdomen tightened. And then she remembered. She was supposed to start her period that day. She was like clockwork. Or, at least that's what she remembered. She hadn't been like clockwork for over 3 years now. But that tightness in her abdomen. She was pregnant again. Holy. She felt like crying. It had happened again. She ran back to her bedroom, rummaging through her things, her nightstand, her drawers. Anything. That's when she found it. A note she'd written to herself. It said one word. Remember. Remember what? Every damn time. Every time. She paced away, throwing the rumpled sticky note onto her bed. She raked her hair back off of her face. Shit. 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 Stopping, she searched for her phone. It was right where she'd left it on her nightstand. Sinking onto the edge of the bed, she searched through her contacts for Sandy's name and hit the call button. Sandy picked up after 2 rings. Hey. It happened again, didn't it? They'd been having this same conversation once a month for the past 3 years. Yes, Gail said, a quiver entering tone as she felt tears well up. Her mind was screaming at her to remember. 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 She just couldn't grasp what she was supposed to recall. Okay. I'll get you in today. I don't have my schedule, Sandy said. But stop by and we'll check you out. I'm scared, Gail said. Sandy paused a moment. I know. But, we're close. You'll see when you get here. Just, be careful. Gail nodded. See you in a bit. Yup. Gail pulled the phone away from her ear and hung up. There was something she was supposed to remember. Something. She just had no idea what that was supposed to be. But maybe she was about to find out. The end.
This is an exclusive production of the Romance Fiction Club. We hope you had a good time listening. Please like and subscribe so that we can continue creating free content for you to enjoy. Check out our library for more exciting romance stories. Thank you and have a wonderful day. See you soon. Bye-bye.